Hello, and today what we're going to be looking at is the global silver trade. And this is going to be a continuation of the bigger concept of the interconnected world that is taking place in 1450 to 1750. So we've talked about the Columbian Exchange, we've talked about the spread of Catholicism, and now we're going to take a look at an economic development, which is the growth of the global silver trade. So, as we look at this, what we want to think about is the economics between 1500 and 1750. And the economics, in one way, is still very much like the economics before 1500. There's a continuity. There's still a great demand for the goods that are produced and available in the Asian markets from the non Asian world. Remember, it was the Europeans' motivation to connect to the Spice Islands and to the Asian trade that pushes the Europeans out onto the Atlantic Ocean to find all water routes to the Asian markets. The Asian markets at this time are still the leading producers of manufactured goods in the global community. So that's a continuity. That's something that we saw with the Song dynasty. We saw that continue under the Ming dynasty. And here we are still between 1500 and 1750. China is the driving producer of the world's goods. And the Asian markets, the Spice Islands, China, India, are still highly sought after markets. The change, however, is how the trade networks have developed. As we've talked in this course, we've focused on four major trade routes: the Indian Ocean, the Silk Road, the Sub Saharan trade or the Trans Saharan trade network, and the Mediterranean Sea. What's happened in 1500 to 1750 is we've shifted that trade route to the Atlantic Ocean. And now the Atlantic Ocean is playing a more pivotal role in trade. And accessing the Indian Ocean for the Europeans is now going around Africa through the Atlantic Ocean. So the Atlantic Ocean is playing a bigger role, which is going to disrupt and diminish the other four major networks. And later, we're going to see how the Pacific Ocean is going to start becoming a trade network as well, or a trade route as well. But what truly creates a global economy is the role that silver will play. American silver is going to start circulating throughout the globe, and we are truly going to create the global economy, a global market that is followed by one commodity, which is silver. So that is going to be the emphasis of today's lecture. And take a look at the global flow of silver. And there's just a couple things that I want you to note. First of all, in the Americas, where you see the sort of the dotted area that represents the Spanish Americas, notice how most of the silver originates in the Americas. And that silver is going to go across the Atlantic Ocean to the Afro-Eurasian world. And then throughout the Afro-Eurasian world, or the Afro-Eurasian world, it's going to work through maritime trade routes, the Mediterranean, the Atlantic Ocean around the west coast of Africa, through the Indian Ocean, and silver is going to make its way out east. And if you take a look, all arrows seem to be pointing to eventually China. Also, if you look at Mexico, you'll see an arrow pointing across the Pacific Ocean and then continuing into the Philippines. And then from the Philippines, it goes to China. You'll notice a third point of origin, a dot in Tokugawa, Japan, which is going to point to China. So two things we can see about this flow. One, there are three major silver mines on this map. One in Mexico, one in South America, and one in Japan. And eventually, the second thing we can notice is that eventually the silver makes its way to China. So China is going to play a pivotal role in the silver trade. So let's talk about China. The first thing is to realize that China is driving the demand for silver. And this relates back to a tax policy that's adopted by the Ming Chinese dynasty. The Ming are going to change their tax policies and require all taxes to be paid in the form of silver. So now tax payments coming in one form, silver, is going to streamline the collection of taxation, which is going to benefit the Ming government and the central government overall. But it also requires more silver. So there's a greater demand for silver. Chinese merchants are now going to be looking for silver because they know that silver is going to be in high demand, and that is potentially a much more profitable business. So the Chinese merchants are going to look to the trade partners that they have to see if they can access silver. And this is the global response. The global response is to supply silver to the Chinese. So China creates the demand. And then what happens is that the world starts to seek out silver mines and silver deposits and begin the mining process of those that silver stash, if you will, and start getting that silver into the Chinese markets. And we're going to talk more specifically about the different areas of the world that respond to this demand. But if you also think about it, it comes down to this. Since everybody desires Chinese goods, to have China say, you know what, we'll give you access to these markets if you have silver, motivates everybody to go out and find the silver because it gives them access to the Chinese markets. And China is going to become known as the world's silver drain because what's happening is that silver is coming into China. And eventually, this is going to cause inflation because as you add more and more silver to the society, you start decreasing the value of silver because there's more silver available. And when you decrease the price of a piece of currency, you ultimately increase, I'm sorry, if you decrease the value of the currency, you increase the price of a product. And that's why China is going to be experiencing this inflation that will soon happen. But this growth of silver coming in China is going to spark economic activity because what Chinese producers are going to do is focus on producing more of the products that the world wants in order to attain more of the silver. And that's going to lead to greater specialization. So we've seen this before. We saw this in the Song Dynasty with the arrival of champa rice, how it creates a population boom. This population has a food supply that allows them to specialize. Same things happening in Ming and Qing China is that in this case, it's the American crops that are creating the food supply. But what the silver allows for is a demand for Chinese production, which means that there's going to be more Chinese merchants or I'm sorry, Chinese producers specializing in order to meet this increasing demand. Now, as they increase their demand for Chinese products, more and more wood is going to be required. So the wood is going to be required for construction of houses, to sustain a population that's growing, but also to fuel fires necessary in the melting or the smelting of metal or the metal metallurgy practices that are required to increase production. And this is going to lead to a large scale deforestation throughout China. So this is a great example of how economic changes can impact natural resources and impact the environment. So big point with silver in China, you want to recognize that it's China's demand for silver that is going to drive the increased production of silver. You also want to realize that the increased amount of silver coming into China is going to lead to inflation within China. So now we go to silver in the Americas, and this is probably the biggest piece of it. Mining operations are going to start popping up throughout the Americas. And one of the biggest mining operations is located in Bolivia at a city called Potosi. Potosi, it sits atop one of the world's largest silver deposits. And mining operations are going to begin, I would say around the 1560s, 1570s, as the demand for silver is increasing. And Potosi is going to become the world's leading silver producer. And I believe it wasn't until about 2014 that it finally stopped producing silver. In other words, they finally mined everything available. That's just how big of a supply Potosi offered. So this mining operation is going to supply silver to the Spanish. So this is a real benefit for the Spaniards. They're sitting on what is today Bolivia. They're sitting on that silver mine. There's an increased demand for silver. Now the Spaniards get to be the suppliers of the silver. And this is potentially great profit. A smaller source of silver, but still significant, was located in Mexico at Zacatecas. I'm going to go with that pronunciation today. I apologize if I butchered that, but this is just another silver mine. It's going to have a lot of the same features. What I would strongly urge you to know is Potosi. Potosi is the big one. Um, the question is, of course, how do you get the labor to mine the silver? And this is where labor sources are going to come into play. So, and with labor sources, you can put in the term coerced labor. And we've seen throughout history how there is efforts to force people to do work or to coerce them to do work. And if you're thinking that coerced labor is slavery, it's not. Slavery is a form of coerced labor, but there are many different types of coerced labor. And one stems from the Incomita system. So the Incomita system is sort of like feudalism or manorialism from Europe in colonial Spanish America. So if you just follow me for a second, as the Spaniards started to settle land in the Americas, the Spanish law essentially said they could employ any of the Native Americans who were on the land that they claimed, much like the serfs in Europe. So a lord controls a manor and controls a bunch of land. And that's a very scientific, historical terminology. But they control huge tracts of land. And these huge tracts of land have people living on it. And the law says that the Lord can make those people work for him. And the Incomita system is just that in the Americas. And instead of us looking at them as serfs, we see them as Native Americans who are forced into labor. We wouldn't quite call it slavery, even though it has a lot of similarities, because it's not essentially a property question, but it is forced labor. And the Native Americans who are kind of pushed into this labor are sent to mines to mine the silver for the Spaniards. Now, of course, what's going to ultimately happen is that as the Native American population diminishes because of connection to the European diseases, we are going to see enslaved Africans also working in the mines. Um, the second thing we bring in is the role of the Midas system. So if you remember back to the Inca Empire imposed what was called the Maida system on the people within its empire. And the idea was to force those people to give labor to the government. And it was basically a form of labor tax. The idea is instead of paying money or paying food, I'm going to pay with my labor. And men between the ages of 15 and 50 were required every year to provide labor to the state. But usually this labor focused on infrastructure projects, building bridges, building roads, maintaining warehouses, ultimately things that benefited the society. What the Spaniards are going to do is use that Midas system to justify putting the Native Americans to work in the mines. The Spaniards would essentially say, well, the Inca used this system, we're using the same system. So get to work. And then lastly, there are voluntary sources of labor. In other words, there are Native Americans and there are, um, Native Americans and poor lower class Europeans who seek out the work at the silver mines. Hazardous as it may be, it provides a paycheck and it provides economic opportunity. So there will certainly be voluntary sources of labor. So the labor that's provided in these mines is a mixture of both what we might call coerced labor and low wage labor that people had sought out. And then lastly, what's interesting is that the city of Potosi is another example of a theme we've been playing with. is that economic activity will lead to the growth and development of cities. So if you guys remember from the Silk Road, we had cities like Samarkand. You remember from the Trans-Saharan trade, we had cities like Timbuktu. From the Indian Ocean, we had cities like Mombasa. And from the Mediterranean trade, we had cities like Venice. Well, now we have a new trading economic activity developing, and Potosi is going to grow as a city. It's not just going to be a mining operation. So the mining operation starts, and that starts to attract settlers. That starts to attract secondary businesses, businesses that are going to sell tools to support the silver mining operations. So you're going to kind of create a whole city, and it's going to become one of the largest cities in the Americas after a while. So when you look at the Americas, they are being used to supply the silver that the Chinese are demanding. And the Spaniards are the ones who are really benefiting from this arrangement. So it's the Spanish government that is benefiting from it, which brings me to silver in Europe. For Spain, this is an economic boon. It is going to bring in a great deal of wealth to Spain in the 1500s, and it's going to propel Spain forward as an economic superpower of Europe in the 1500s. Now, it's not going to last long, but for Spain, this is a great deal of wealth because they're in on the ground level, if you will. But of course, anytime I bring in currency into an economic system, that will lead to inflation of prices. So Spain and Europe, but Spain mostly, is going to experience an inflation as this American silver comes into their societies. And if I go back to the impact on Spain for a second, the Spaniards are also going to use this wealth to fund the building of ships, to fund the building of a navy. If you are familiar with a thing called the Spanish Armada, the Spanish Armada was a Spanish fleet that had designs to invade England in 1588. And the money that was used to build that fleet came directly from the trade in silver. So, as more European countries get involved, there becomes kind of an arms race, which we would call probably a navy race. And the competition between the nations for access to these trading markets are going to grow. Spanish treasure ships are going to come under attack from English sea dogs, and that's going to heighten the tension and the competition amongst Europe. The other thing is that if you remember that map at the beginning, Europe is going to expand its role in the global trade. More ships are going to be sailing into Asia, bringing along silver, and leaving Asia with Asian goods to bring back to the European markets. So you have this idea that Europe, as a result of global silver trade, is going to expand their role even more in the global trade network, connecting the Americas to Afro-Eurasia. Finally, we want to look at Japan, and we're going to kind of step aside and look at Japan and think about how silver is going to impact them. So when we've talked about Japan last unit, we talked about how in the 1500s, there's a centralization movement going on under the leadership of the Tokugawa shogun. So by about 1600, 1500, 1600s, Japan is centralizing, unifying, and the family that ultimately leads this effort is going to be referred to as the Tokugawa. And then, of course, you have the daimyos, who are those regional landlords who are being brought under control. Those regional landlords had their own private armies. And what the Tokugawa shogunate is doing is defeating those armies and ending the daimyo's independence, if you will, and centralizing power to the Tokugawa shogun. And this is made possible because of silver. So Japan has silver mines, and Japan is a very close neighbor of China. So what Japan is able to do is start mining that silver, trading that silver with China, and as a consequence, the wealth is going to flow into Japan. Japan's going to make a bundle off of this. And the person or the family that makes the bundle is the Tokugawa. The Tokugawa family is going to control the silver mines. They're going to use the profits from the silver mines to fund the building of their army and fund their campaigns to bring the daimyos under control. So again, you can see how silver has ramifications, not just in China, but also in the Americas, in Europe, and Japan. So when you look back over silver, you want to think about here's this global commodity that's connecting the world. American silver is flowing throughout the globe, and it has an impact on Japan's political development. It has an impact on Europe's political development. It's going to have an impact on China's economic development. It's going to have an impact on the development of the city of Potosi, and it's going to impact labor systems in the Americas, leading to a coercion of labor from both Native Americans and from enslaved Africans. So the silver is going to have is more than just it's being traded around the globe. It's going to impact different societies in different ways. And I do want to end by going back to the map from the beginning. And as you look at the map, what I want you to take a look at is you see the trade going across the Atlantic Ocean. But if you take a look at Mexico and you see the flow of trade going across the Pacific Ocean into the Philippines, and then from the Philippines, there would be direct access to the Chinese market. We now have a trade route that connects the Americas to Asia across the Pacific Ocean. And they're called the Manila, no, sorry, I apologize. The Manila galleons. And we'll talk about this in class. But the Manila galleons is going to be an example of a new trade route that's emerging in about the 1500s, late 1500s, early 1600s. And that trade route is going to be due to the fact that the Europeans figure out the trade winds and the currents across the Pacific Ocean that allow them to travel safely to the Philippines and then to return to Mexico. And now we're creating a new network of trade. So silver is part of this new and developing trade network of the 15 to 1750 period of time. So with that, as always, note any questions and come to class with them. Otherwise, next time we'll focus on another development from this changing economic system, and we'll take a look at the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade that begins to grow and develop as a result of this economic development in the Americas. In the meantime, have a good day. I will talk to you next time. Bye.